いか、ケンシロウ。遊びはもう終わりだ。Of all the media in which the world of Fist of the North Star has been portrayed, perhaps there is none more perfectly suited, none that captures the fun and interactive possibilities better than the medium of video games. It lends itself perfectly. You have a world populated with larger-than-life heroes, strong and virtuous and tough as nails. You have villains as black-hearted and evil as they are large and intimidating. You have unique and instantly recognizable fighting styles. There are central good guys and bad guys, both of whom it is interesting to put oneself in their shoes, but there is also a wealth of side characters with their own unique aspects and stories to explore. Desperate citizens trying to establish a sense of home in a broken world. Fair maidens who are no damsels in distress. Hopeful children who can still find reasons to smile and look to the future. Not to mention the iconic locations, the grand set pieces, the epic and memorable lines of dialogue. All of these can translate excellently when it comes to a video game that puts you in the iconic shoes of the savior at the end of the century. Whether it be a fully realized 3D adventure, or a basic side-scrolling action game with the simple but clear idea of one good guy beating up a lot of bad guys. In this episode, we will take a look at Kenshiro and the world of Fist of the North Star as expressed in the world of video games, bearing in mind that there are well over dozens of games that have some connection to Hokuto no Ken, spanning many different genres and styles, and we will try our best to spend more of our time and focus on the games that really got it right and showed off the end-of-the-century wasteland in the best way possible, and which were undoubtedly the most fun. The very first game of Fist of the North Star was released in 1986, 2 years after the 1984 release of the first anime series, and 3 years after the 1983 release of the original manga. It was called Hokuto no Ken, Violence Gekiga Adventure. Gekiga meaning literally dramatic picture, a term for more mature or adult-oriented comics. And that is basically what the game is a kind of playable comic book. Not exactly the most exciting entry into the video game landscape, and not likely to be remembered by many outside of the most devoted of Japanese fans, as it was made for the PC-8801, which was a line of game and home computers primarily sold in Japan throughout the 80s. Notably, it was made by the eventually very successful video game company Enix, now Square Enix, makers of the landmark Dragon Quest series, among others. Violence Gekiga Adventure is somewhat like a precursor to later point-and-click games, like several made by LucasArts, but a lot more basic. You essentially have the character Bat narrating what is happening on mostly still images on the screen, with the right side alternating between the cardinal directions Kenshiro can move in, and a list of verb commands for things the player can try to do. Combat, while basic, is at least true to Hokuto no Ken as the technology allows, with the player moving your fists to strike pressure points on your enemies within a time limit. The sound effects even give their best to give Ken his signature "ah ta 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 ta." Though it is the first game of Fist of the North Star, you can tell why it is a Gekiga, as the scenes are pretty violent, the enemies exploding in red blood, unlike the somewhat toned-down television series. Violence Gekiga Adventure is the first of any video game representing Fist of the North Star, and certainly true to the source material, and notable as such, but it was not really the first game to hit it out of the park in terms of playability and just plain fun. That would be the second game, and the next on our list. Also released in 1986, the simply titled Hokuto no Ken was released for the Sega Master System, also known as the Sega Mark III in Japan. Hokuto no Ken is everything you could hope to expect for a video game about the world of the savior at the end of the century. It has clear, recognizable sprites of Kenshiro and his iconic enemies, and simple, satisfying fighting where Ken's enemies comically explode in pieces. I even admire the parallax scrolling effects between the background and foreground. Recognizable mini-bosses like Heart or Club are handled the standard way, but when Ken gets into a big boss fight, the camera angle closes in with a more detailed sprite palette, and a more intense battle ensues, ending with an iconic and very true to the source material finishing move. I cannot heap enough praise on this game for what it accomplished for its time. It even has the iconic lines and poses done very well. One funny thing that needs to be mentioned is how this game was localized in the international version. The first, and one of a very few Fist of the North Star games ever released in North America, though at first you wouldn't know it. Not being particularly well known in the States at the time, the developers opted to make generalized, generic changes, calling the game Black Belt and suiting Ken up in a standard white karate gi, making the story a basic tale of a karate fighter named Riki on a mission to rescue his girlfriend Kyoko, a storyline that all but rips off the 1984 arcade classic Kung Fu. If you are aware of the storyline of Fist of the North Star, this version of events is just hilarious. Seeing Ken take on sumo wrestlers, fighting what appears to be a woman named Rita, and I can't get over how cute Hart looks in his Fu Manchus. Next on our list is another 1986 offering, this time from Toei Animation by way of Shoei System, again simply titled Hokuto no Ken. This would be the first in a series of 7 games that tried out various genres and types of game, the first 4 on the NES and the final 3 on the Super Nintendo. A recognizable and quick-fisted Kenshiro scrolls left instead of right as he fights off several enemies. Lots of projectiles like thrown knives litter the area as Ken's fists make his enemies stop, writhe in agony, and then explode. Boss battles between the classic enemies have many elements resembling the anime, like when Ken kicks Hart in his weak belly, or closing the distance to fight within Raoul's fighting aura. With all the projectiles and enemies to fight, it was a difficult game, but not bad for the first of the series. The next game, Hokuto no Ken 2 in Japan, was just localized as Fist of the North Star in America, losing the Part 2 and treating it as if it were a separate game of its own. Similar to the Master System game, Ken goes through levels, toppling large stacks of identical enemies on the way to a boss fight. Missing here, though, are the interesting death animations and the detailed boss fights. These games are not without their charms, though. Ken's animation is quick and reminiscent of his animated persona. When you collect enough power-ups, Ken explodes in rage and loses his shirt. Also, his animation speeds up along with his power. One other thing about these games that is likely lost on Western viewers, though very nostalgic for Japanese ones. Back in the original animation, when Ken would take out his enemies, they would often die saying nonsense words like Hidebu or Abeshi, which don't really translate to anything tangible, and are often left out of a translation. Fans who pay attention to these things can find cheeky references to these words in the background in some other Fist of the North Star media. Remember this for later. In these games, when you punch an enemy, they will sometimes die, and the word Abeshi or Hidebu appears in hiragana, which acts as a power-up. The 2 games are largely the same, using the same graphics, the same stages, and the same music. The difference largely being in the difficulty, Hokuto no Ken 2 being much harder. Overall, I wouldn't say that these games are great, the criticism being they're a little buggy, a little repetitive and short, and truthfully, they don't live up to the excellent example of the Master System game. But as the series went on, they tried different things. Hokuto no Ken 3 and 4, the last ones on the NES, went for a sort of Dragon Quest-style JRPG, with Ken and company traversing a map and getting into turn-based battles that still reflected the Hokuto no Ken sensibilities. Part 3 recreating most of the familiar storylines with Kenshiro, whilst Part 4 told the story of a new descendant of the Hokuto bloodline on his way to becoming the new successor. They follow the tropes of most JRPGs at the time, with a list of verbs to choose how to interact with the environment, and fights with one or several party members choosing from a list of commands. In 1992, Hokuto no Ken 5 brought more of the same, this time to the Super Nintendo, with enhanced graphics and battles which, while turn-based, at least had visual representations of the characters fighting, much like its contemporaries like Final Fantasy IV. Finally, Hokuto no Ken 6 and 7, released in 1992 and 1993 respectively, lost the RPG style and changed it up in favor of a tournament fighter type of game, following the runaway successes of games like Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat of around the same time period. Overall, the Toei Shoei series of games was only modestly successful, and mostly only with the Japanese, Part 2 being the only game of the series to be released outside of Japan. That being said, I have noticed some Japanese using the sprites in their own independent videos, proving that the games are fondly remembered by some who enjoyed them in the late 80s and early 90s. And speaking of more Hokuto games of the 80s made by Toei, there was also an entry for the Game Boy and the Mega Drive. Both released in 1989, the Game Boy game, Fist of the North Star, 10 Big Brawls for the King of Universe is another tournament fighter with decent graphics and gameplay. Kenshiro fights through a line of the usual suspects, culminating with a fight with the villainous Kaiô from the Series 2 anime. But probably the best overall game of around this time was the Mega Drive game called Hokuto no Ken Shin Seikimatsu Kyusei Shudensetsu, or The New Legend of the Savior at the End of the Century. This game, which was also made by Sega, is a graphically and technically enhanced version of the original Master System game. Ken traverses a land of fist-fodder enemies who die with all the head-exploding fun fans have come to enjoy. Similar to the NES games, Ken will gain power and lose his shirt in a fit of rage, gaining faster and more powerful attacks. He has to contend with enemies and also environmental hazards like spikes and flying projectiles like axes. In every way, it takes the simple fun of the first Master System game and improves on the visuals and beat-em-up fun. This game also concludes with an epic final battle with Kaiô. And it wouldn't be complete without a heavily changed-up English localization. Enter Last Battle. A dizzying affair which, as you can see, tells the story of the hero, Arzak, along with his companions, Alyssa and Max, fighting the evil Empire, using the ancient art of Jet Kwon-do against the evil Grom, Gross, and Garok. And Arzak needs to break the seal to triumph over Garok and rescue Alyssa. Again, one of the beautiful things about the theme of one good guy against a lot of bad guys is that it is so simple and clear, I suppose you don't even need to know what's going on to know what's going on. I don't really mind the story changes. Removing the blood, however, was much more impactful. The last game made in the 90s, once again simply entitled Hokuto no Ken, was a game made by Banpresto for the PlayStation and Sega Saturn in 1995. This is something of a graphical adventure which kind of looks like a playable cartoon. Most of the game is fully rendered cartoon animation, telling the story of a grown-up bat about to marry Lin before she is kidnapped by members of the Dark Hokuto gang. After Bat takes a beating, Kenshiro is once again enlisted to help. The game progresses as Ken mainly moves around with text to narrate and move the story along until he gets into an encounter, and a kind of hybrid RPG-style battle begins. In my opinion, this kind of playable cartoon was perfected a couple of years later with The Curse of Monkey Island in 1997. But perhaps that's a different story, as Monkey Island games never really worried about a combat system. This would be the last Fist of the North Star game until, well, the end of the century. 5 years later, in March of 2000, Konami came out with a very unique and very fitting entry into the series. Fighting Mania, aka Punch Mania Hokuto no Ken, is an arcade game where you put on padded gloves and actually take a whack at bad guys, Kenshiro style. There are 3 playable characters, Ken, Rei, and Raoul. At the beginning of the game, you choose a path, which is kind of a fixed story arc, and as opponents appear on the screen, 6 red pads will pop out as you hit them, similar to the game Whack-A-Mole. You can really end up working a sweat on this machine, especially when you beat out something like 50 or so hits for a combo in rapid succession. Later that year, a sequel, Punch Mania Hokuto no Ken 2, Clash in the Land of Shura, came out in Japan. It contains all the paths of the original game, along with 5 new paths based on Series 2 of the original series, fighting enemies like Bask and Celia, as well as the ability to play as Ken's bounty hunter friend Ain, along with verses and tag teaming and such. Next, also in 2000, came the first 3D action entry into the series. Made by Bandai, Hokuto no Ken Seikimatsu Kyusei Shudensetsu for the original PlayStation tells the story of the original manga series all the way through to Ken's climactic battle with Raoul, and does a decent job of it, both graphically and action-wise. But unfortunately, like a lot of the games on our list, it's only released in Japan. Many nostalgic scenes and scenarios are recreated well in all their head-exploding glory, and finally, for the first time in 3 dimensions. The controls are a bit crude, being the first of its kind, but a decent rendering of the story. A few years later, in 2004, Sega would once again make an updated version of the original Mark III classic. Released for the PS2, Sega Ages 2500 Hokuto no Ken did what Last Battle before it did on the Sega Genesis. It updated the simple perfection of the Mark III game with clearer, cleaner graphics, keeping things pretty well the same. Ken goes through a string of baddies up until a more detailed boss fight, this time with special moves, power-ups, and a semi-3D feel to the experience. This is another good game and another good try at the old formula, with the criticism being the controls are a little too repetitive considering the time period. And I can't get over how fun and satisfying it was seeing your enemies crumble into pieces on the Sega, and can't help but feel disappointed at how the newer versions never seem to reach that bar. The next game on our list, while not the last one ever made for Fist of the North Star, can be thought of as something like the main event. Arc System Works, a Japanese video game maker, has become a giant in the world of competitive fighting games, with several major titles under their belt, including series like Guilty Gear, Blaze Blue, and the runaway success of Dragon Ball FighterZ. In 2005, they teamed with Sega to make a high-level competitive fighting arcade game based around the Fist of the North Star world, simply titled Fist of the North Star. This game, in my opinion, reaches the pinnacle of what fans wanted and expected ever since the beginning. It was not the first fighting game, not the first to allow you to pick from different characters, and not the first to display iconic scenes and dialogue from the source material. It was just the one that did them the best. Once again, I'm in a position where I can't heap enough praise on this game for what it accomplished. This is not the clunky, substandard fighter from the SNES era. This is a well-made fighting game with finely crafted fighting styles, combos, special moves, and strategies. The animation is excellent, the level of attention to detail, the depth of styles and variety of strategies, the amazing set pieces, and even the music all come together to create a representation of the world of Hokuto no Ken that is just superb, and does much honor to the original source material. You can recreate iconic battles, or just play different what-if scenarios. Some of the animations and moves are so well done, and even downright hilarious to see them performed on the wrong characters. As a fighting game, Fist of the North Star stands tall. The only criticism I would give it is perhaps there are not enough characters. And if by any chance Arc Systems is listening, imagine the possibilities of dusting off this classic and revamping it with a modern palette and really stretching the roster with an already built-in ocean of iconic characters. In 2007, the game was ported to the PlayStation 2, but once again only in Japan, which is a real shame because not only do I think that this is the best Fist of the North Star video game, I think this is the best Fist of the North Star product ever made, and I can't say that lightly. Not only does the game come as a perfect port of the arcade, but includes a bonus disc with great extra features. There's a tutorial which explains the complexity of the fighting system for beginners. There's also a special show put on by famous Japanese talent that features a quiz show, gameplay of the arcade, and even roleplay to find out who is the most worthy of the title of successor. It really includes so many great moments. One of my favorites that I will point out is an interview with Chiba Shigeru, who was a voice actor on the original show. Remember what I said about nonsense dying words like hidebu and abeshi? He recalls a funny story in which he got yelled at by the director during a taping. Why? Because he tried to sneak in his own name in a cheeky way. Lamentably, most of this fun isn't readily accessible to fans who don't speak Japanese as there was no localization made, which again is a real shame because it is truly a masterpiece and a great collectible. If you can get your hands on it, I couldn't recommend it more, as it is the prize of my own personal collection. Following this, there were a few more games made in the 2010s, again mostly only in Japan. Hokuto Shinken Denshousa no Michi in 2008 is a sort of digital comic of a Nintendo DS utilizing the touchscreen to tap out Fist of the North Star pressure point fighting techniques. Hokuto no Ken Online was a bit of a lackluster MMORPG made by Gung Ho Online Entertainment, a Korean company. In 2009, after the ending of the television series Legends of the Dark King, there was a fighting game for the PSP based on it by the not very well known Interchannel Inc. There were also a couple of series of games that were very similar to each other, including the Gekiuchi series on the PC spanning from 1999 to 2004. The Gekiuchi series was a line of computer games, ostensibly to teach Japanese people to type. Conceptually, it seems a bit odd to me because I think these games are meant to help children type, but the gore factor doesn't exactly pull any punches. I guess it's not all that bad. Another series is the Jisen Pachinko or Pachislot Hishouho series, which are basically digital pachinko and slot machines that feature characters and some animations from the Fist of the North Star universe. Ranging from 2004 to 2012, games in the series were made for the PS2, Nintendo DS, PlayStation Portable, the Wii, and even the PS3. Before we get to the last games on our list, which are the most likely to be known by modern gamers outside of Japan, I will mention there are several games about the magazine Shonen Jump, which featured the original acclaimed Fist of the North Star manga and several other hit manga series, like Dragon Ball or One Piece. These crossover games begin from the original Japanese Famicom, with the 1998 Famicom Jump AU Retsuden, and continue through the Nintendo DS with Jump Ultimate Stars, PlayStation 3 and 4 and Portable with J-Stars Victory Versus, and even continue into the current year at the time of this recording with the 2020 release of Jump Force for the Xbox One, PS4, PC, and Switch. While these games all feature characters from Fist of the North Star, they are mostly crossover fighting games and do not necessarily center around those characters. We will end our list with a trio of games that most Westerners will be most familiar with, as they are some of the most recent and they had the biggest international releases. Ever since its beginning, Japanese video maker Koei has always shown an interest in historical games. Beginning with the acclaimed strategy game Nobunaga's Ambition in 1983 and Romance of the Three Kingdoms in 1985, the company has since partnered with another venerable and successful video game company, Tecmo, to become Koei Tecmo. While they are known for many different kinds of game, mostly strategy or action, perhaps they are best known for the Warriors series of games, with many subsets of series, including Dynasty Warriors, Samurai Warriors, and even Hyrule Warriors, set in Nintendo's Legend of Zelda world of Hyrule. At long last, the stars seem to have aligned themselves just right. As previously mentioned in the retrospective, the Chinese Romance of the Three Kingdoms saga left an unmistakable impression on Fist of the North Star, what with its rich cast of warriors who would take on an army of opponents by themselves and find no man who could stop them. That is the essential style of the Warriors games, when you are in the shoes of a hero mowing down wave after wave of enemies. The echoes of these two series finally caught up with each other in all their fully 3D realized glory, with the 2010 release of Fist of the North Star, Ken's Rage for the PS3 and Xbox 360. This game is an absolute love letter to fans of the original series, putting players into the shoes of Kenshiro, Raoul, Mamiya, and several others, fighting waves of bad guys through various challenge modes, or going through the original story of the manga. Each character has an updated but classic look and recreates the mythos of Fist of the North Star, giving the player many techniques and ways to take down the marauding hordes. There's also a rock and roll feel to the game, which suits the narrative very well. It was followed up just a few years later in 2013 with Ken's Rage 2 for the PS3, Xbox 360, and Wii U. It is much the same as the original, with many of the same story arcs, but adds new ones and new scenarios and character backstories. Also, the gameplay was modified to a more typical Warriors type of game experience, with faster combat and significantly more enemies on screen to fight. The project garnered significant attention, with promotions being done internationally by Tetsuo Hara himself. But, as with most titles under the Warriors series of games, they only seemed popular amongst the Japanese, and were met with a rather tepid reception internationally. Westerners just didn't seem impressed with the repetitive style of games, and even though there is a significant fan base for Fist of the North Star outside of Japan, the game sales were disappointing. And now we end almost exactly where we began, with Sega. The company that made unquestionably the best Fist of the North Star games also made the most recent, the 2018 release of Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise for the PS4. Lost Paradise is an action RPG that puts the player once again in the shoes of Kenshiro, fighting waves of baddies in the wastelands. While the game begins with the touch of the familiar, recreating Ken's most iconic rematch with Shin, the story then quickly branches into a completely new tale, centering around the city of Eden, a city which surprisingly has wealth and abundance unlike any other place in the wastelands. and a city in which Kenshiro has heard a rumor that his lost love Yuria now resides. Sega modeled Lost Paradise using many elements of its successful Yakuza series, with the action of a beat-em-up, the experience and leveling up of an RPG, and tying it all together with several QuickTime events. Also, it needs to be mentioned that Lost Paradise differs from most any other Hokuto no Ken game, and that it has a great sense of humor, even winning an award for comedy writing, especially in the silly minigames that Ken can play on the side. And speaking of minigames, Sega included several of their old classic arcade games in a mini-arcade. That mini-arcade includes, you guessed it, the original Mark III classic. Kenshiro gets to play Kenshiro. It just doesn't get any sweeter than that. While the reception was not dazzling amongst Western critics, they were respectable, and they represented a significant improvement of opinion since the previous Ken's Rage series. And in Japan, the country that birthed Kenshiro, and the country that knows his story the best, it was a smash hit. After roughly 35 years in video games, Fist of the North Star proves that it can be just as successful now as it was from the very beginning. Why? Well, I suppose it's because the story of one good guy beating up a lot of bad guys is indispensable to us. It calls to something deep within us, and it will always be significant, and it will always inspire.